For today's video, we'll be doing something a little bit different. Instead of a more traditional aviation video, we'll be turning to helicopters. And in continuing the recent theme, an early helicopter at that. The first to see combat in the famous Sikorsky R-4. Although see combat might be a bit generous, as we'll get into later. Either way, the story of the R-4 is definitely an interesting one. It was, in many respects, a fundamentally experimental design. While the helicopter entered limited production, it was never built in large numbers, and by and large, it remained limited to testing or second-line duty. Valuable work, to be sure, but it's clear to see that helicopters had some way to go yet. Not that this would matter to the designer Igor Sikorsky, who rather made his name with his helicopters, even if he began in more traditional aircraft. Well, in the full scale. He was experimenting with small, rubber band-powered model helicopters as early as age 12. Or, if you prefer, 1901, as he was born in 1889. Full-size helicopters would come much later. Of those, the most important for today is the VS-300. His first practical design with a patent in 1931, and one that laid the groundwork for not just the R-4, but almost all future helicopter designs. While very primitive in how it appeared, all the main features are there. A single large main rotor mounted to the center of the fuselage, a pilot seated ahead of that rotor's mount, and critically, a large tail boom extending to a secondary tail rotor for stability, with both that rotor as well as the main one powered by a single radial engine of 75 horsepower. Not exactly a lot of power, but the skeletal VS-300 was incredibly lightweight. It had to be, with testing of the VS-300 kicking off shortly after the Second World War began, on September 14, 1939, in a tethered test flight with Sikorsky at the controls, just to be safe. A wise precaution, as the helicopter proved to have stability issues in that original design. On December 19th, it was rolled over by a gust of wind. Modifications were made, and another tethered flight attempted on March 6, 1940. With this flight testing a new tail design fitted with two lifting rotors. Those were mounted horizontally on either side of the tail, attached to small outriggers. A curious setup, to say the least, but understandable for such an early experiment. Though it did, evidently, make it very difficult to fly forward. Even so, the VS-300 made a public demonstration on May 20th, 1940. Further flight testing ultimately culminated in a flight by an Army pilot, Captain H.F. Gregory, who kept the VS-300 airborne for around 8 minutes. Not a long flight, but a successful one. Successful enough for the government to take interest. A joint funding agreement was worked out with Vought Sikorsky to further develop the VS-300. Sikorsky took full advantage, continuing to tweak the design. By April 15, 1941, it was capable of staying airborne for an hour and 5 minutes. On May 6th, this was extended to an hour and 32 minutes. Shortly after that, the VS-300 reached its final form, as it were. The outriggers were removed and replaced by a single vertical tail rotor. This was both more stable and lighter improving the overall performance. The engine was also modified to a 150 horsepower model. A less notable change came with the removal of skids for a nose and tail wheel setup. At points, the VS300 also sported pontoons for water takeoff and landing, with this version of the design making its first flight on December 8, 1941. It could reach speeds of up to 80 miles per hour or 128 kilometers per hour with all the changes to the design. Testing would continue on the VS300 for a couple more years before it was ultimately turned over to the Edison Museum in Dearborn, Michigan on October 7, 1943, by which point it had flown a total time of 102 hours, 34 minutes, and 51 seconds. The focus had, in any event, shifted to the VS-316, alternatively the S-47, depending on the source, or to use the military designation, the XR-4. While based on the VS-300, this was a larger craft, replacing the single-person cockpit for a two-person cabin, the pilot and observer seated side by side in that small cabin. However, despite that noteworthy change, the core design principles remained similar. The single main rotor, the long tail boom, and the tail rotor, powered by a 165 horsepower engine driving the three-bladed main rotor. Each of those blades was 18 feet or 5.4 meters long, with two wheels mounted on either side of the cabin, along with a smaller wheel on the tail. Initially on the middle of the boom, then on the production model at the tip of the tail. That establishes the background, so let's turn to the testing now. The first prototype XR-4 would be wheeled out relatively early, shortly after the Pearl Harbor attack in early December 1941. At this point, however, it was mostly for static testing. It wouldn't do its first flight until the new year, specifically on January 14th, 1942. A large crowd gathered to watch this momentous occasion, consisting of both government officials and company dignitaries. Details on the flight are sparse, but it was clearly successful. If there were any major issues, those would undoubtedly have been recorded. As I haven't seen any, well, that speaks for itself, as does the continued testing of the prototype over the course of 1942. By April, the machine was being put through its paces in increasingly elaborate ways. For example, hovering up to a pole to slip a tube through a brass ring, or lifting a sack of eggs to circle around the airfield, and then land so gently that none of the eggs broke. And in another test, lowering a telephone headset to communicate with an officer on the ground. These were all well and good, of course, but the two most dramatic tests were yet to come. One involved lowering a 25-foot rope ladder down to the ground, where a brave volunteer climbed the rope, allowing the XR-4 to carry him off. Other flights reversed this, showing the capability to deliver personnel, be it military or civilian firefighters. On top of which, there was also a flight where 4 people were carried skyward, the cockpit crew and a mechanic on either wheel. While the final test in this list, if not chronologically, was the most important. On April 20th, 1942, there was a demonstration to show that the XR-4 was ready for delivery. That involved doing a power-off auto rotation, an emergency landing maneuver where the force of wind in a glide would provide just enough lift to land safely. It had, understandably, never been attempted before. There was no established procedure for this. The test pilot, Les Morris, would have to break new ground, which he did, safely landing the XR-4, keeping it intact, of course, but also demonstrating it was a safe and controllable machine should the power fail. Later testing by Morris could come within a foot of a handkerchief target on the ground when auto-rotating. During all of this, the XR-4 also proved capable of 82 miles per hour, 132 kilometers per hour at its top speed, in addition to reaching an altitude of 5,000 feet, 1,524 meters. This work established several potential roles for a production helicopter, from convoy escorts to patrol or observation, and perhaps most famously for aerial ambulance and rescue duty. Hold that thought for later. For the moment, the Army was suitably impressed. On May 30th, 1942, they accepted delivery of the XR-4, after insisting on a 761-mile, 1,225-kilometer flight from Bridgeport, Connecticut to Wright Field in Ohio, where the helicopter also managed an even higher altitude of 12,000 feet, 3,700 meters. This flight overall pushed the XR-4 to 100 flight hours and 90 miles per hour, 145 kilometers per hour, without any major incidents. 2 other records were set as well. A distance record of 92 miles, 148 kilometers, and an endurance record of 1 hour and 50 minutes. It took 5 days, starting on May 13th, 1942, and concluding on May 18th, with Les Morris at the controls and Igor Sikorsky in the observer's seat. Credit where it's due, Sikorsky certainly trusted his work. Further testing would follow through to 1943, with the Army satisfied enough on January 5th to send the XR-4 back to Sikorsky, where further modifications would produce the XR-4C, with a larger main rotor, 38 feet or 11.5 meters in diameter, and a new 200 horsepower engine. Testing of the XR-4C would further cement the success of the design, with the Army Air Force ordering 15 YR-4A developmental prototypes. Another 14 were ordered as well, bringing the total to 29. The first 3 would be called YR-4A, with the rest designated YR-4B after some modifications were made. That model would then be the basis of the production R-4B, of which 100 were built in total, with some modifications like the moving of the tailwheel, or relocating the exhaust pipe to the side instead of the bottom, as well as the fitting of a 180 horsepower engine. Testing of the XR, YR, and R4s continued through 1943. For example, the Navy would test both the XR and the YR4s. With pontoons, the XR4 was put to use in takeoff and landing from Lake Erie, while the traditional landing gear was tested on May 6th and 7th, 1943, from Bunker Hill. Not the carrier, but a freighter modified with a landing platform. 24 landings and takeoffs were made from that ship, both anchored and underway, including ferrying people from ship to shore, another first for the XR-4. Meanwhile, later in July, more testing, this time including a YR-4, took place on the James Parker. A luxury liner uses a troop ship. The hope for this testing was that the R-4 could be used for anti-submarine warfare, particularly on ships like Parker or Queen Mary that often sailed without escorts due to their high speed. Considering that those tests took place in the open ocean with 40-knot winds, it's quite a success for the little helicopter. Enough of one that the Navy also ordered some of those helicopters. 19 in total, with 3 sent to the Coast Guard, with those redesignated HNS-1, with another helicopter sent up to the Arctic to do very successful cold weather testing. Interestingly, during all of this, the British caught wind of the testing as well. They sent a ship over in 1944, the SS Dagestan. Testing aboard that vessel impressed the British enough to take 41 of the production R-4Bs, split between the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, under the name Hoverfly 1. Ultimately, 131 would be built. 1 XR-4, 3 YR-4As, 27 YR-4Bs, and 100 R-4Bs. And this concludes the testing. Let's briefly touch on service history, such as it was. For the most part, this was kept well away from any active combat. It was recognized the R-4 wasn't really fit to fly into that. It was too fragile and an easy target. As such, the vast majority of active service was spent on transport work, such as ferrying parts in the South Pacific, or carrying wounded to and from medical stations. Important work, to be sure, but nowhere near actual fighting. The same could be said for rescuing men from a weather station on January 22, 1945. This was a very high-flying affair, ranging from 4,700 to 10,000 feet, 1,400 to 3,000 meters. The British, for their part, put their R-4s to use, rescuing down pilots in the English Channel, and watching for U-boats as well. Another rescue in May 1945 saw an R-4 used to rescue the stranded crew of a Canadian plane that had crashed in Labrador. On May 2nd, the pilot of the R-4 flew several flights to rescue all 9 of the Canadians. All of these rescues were impressive, to be sure, in their own way. But the truly impressive rescues were the combat rescues, the first of which came on April 22nd, 1944, when Army Lieutenant Carter Harmon flew a YR-4B in Burma. He would pick up 3 injured British soldiers and an American pilot who had been shot down behind Japanese lines. It took 2 different flights due to the limited space on the YR-4. Nonetheless, Harmon pulled it off without attracting Japanese attention. We'll be returning to this topic at the end of the video. For the moment, other R-4s and other pilots performed rescue operations in that theater, including one rescue in April 1945, when another R-4 picked up an Army pilot, James Green, after he crashed at high altitude. A landing zone had to be hacked clear, and the R-4's pilot, Raymond Murdoch, needed a rolling start to get airborne. Even so, he pulled it off, and in so doing, would save Green's life. Moving away from Burma, several R-4s would be put to use evacuating wounded soldiers from outside Manila in the Philippines. This was over the course of June 15th to July 29th, 1945. Ultimately, up to 80 soldiers were evacuated, including under active Japanese fire. the largest and most dangerous rescue operation by helicopter prior to the more famous Korean War operation. As impressive as all of this was, however, the R-4 wouldn't last long into the 1950s before being retired. I haven't seen reference to them serving in Korea at all, even though the survivors were designated H-4B in 1948. And on the subject of survivors, a handful are still around today. An R-4B in storage in Canada, a hoverfly on display at the Royal Air Force Museum in London, and 8 helicopters in the United States, the XR-4C, 6 R-4Bs, and 1 HNS-1. Now, before I wrap this up, we'll go back to that first operation in Burma. If you're from my generation, you might know this operation and the R-4 from the fictionalized version in Medal of Honor Rising Sun. Not at all accurate to the actual events, but one of those little quirks of old historical games, showing forgotten weapons like this. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.